Uh,
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Impact at Scale podcast with Zal Dastur. My guest today is Brian Sheng, the co founder and CEO of Aquaria. Hi, Brian. How's it going?
I'm doing great, Zal. Great. We're on the opposite side of the world right now, but great start to the day.
I appreciate you taking the time. Brian, can you give me just a bit of an introduction to your background, and then tell us a little bit about Aquaria?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been a founder my entire career, and before I started Aquaria, I actually started a early stage venture studio called Fresh. Um, and I've always been curious about the future and what the future looks like and building a better future. And so, what Fresh was focused on was deep technology and deep technology that had an impact, had a mission with a purpose. And so that's actually how I got into climate quite early on, is looking at technologies with impact. Obviously, you very easily come across climate technologies companies. And so when I exited Fresh in 2018, I was thinking about, well, I want to actually build a company myself that is directly contributing to mitigating climate change or fighting climate change. And so I guess there's a long story behind that, but long story short, that's how I got to start Aquaria.
It's really interesting. You don't normally hear of investors going into entrepreneurs. It's typically the other way around. A successful entrepreneur becomes an investor. Was there, what made you jump into the ring?
Yeah. Well, when I first became a venture investor, I had two main goals. The first one was I wanted to work with founders that were way smarter than myself, and where money wasn't the only, kind of drive and motivation. That's why Fresh was backing companies with an impact angle. And then number two, I was also looking for opportunities actually beyond investing that I can build myself. Actually, I founded Fresh when I was 19, so I didn't really have a lot of experience building any companies. So I think the two things together, so 10 years later, I say, you know what, actually, I think I have a little bit more of what it takes now. I want to build a company and more than just invest.
So tell me about Aquaria. What exactly is the company?
We are building large scale atmospheric water capture devices. So we're trying to solve the global water challenge by harvesting the humidity in the air as a secure and sustainable new source of water for humanity. So how we do that is we are unlocking all of the moisture that's already kind of present in our atmosphere. And instead of drawing from anything in the ground or building large scale facilities, our product we're able to deploy, kind of these boxes, large or small, right where you need them to get water.
What got you? What was the catalyst to get you so interested in water?
Yeah, well, I think Zal, with lots of the guests that've been on your podcast, and we look at a lot of the innovators and investors in climate. I actually think that we're in a good place. With or without me, there's lots of people and lots of technologies being worked on, and in 20 years, we're heading towards a secure and abundant energy future. We'll have many different ways to get sustainable energy, but it's far from guaranteed the fact that as we continue onwards, that we'll have enough water. Um, in fact, if you look at some of those reports they put out about all of the great investment increases and trends in climate tech, water barely makes the last page. Barely makes the last page. So that's what made me think about actually this is like a huge opportunity for me to go do something here. Huge, kind of huge impact angle and huge opportunity to build a new technology that can create a very scalable business.
You're right. In before this interview, I was doing a bit of research, and when you read up on water, you realize that firstly, only 1% of the world's water is drinkable, so a very low amount. We are running out of the sort of ground reserves of water that we have tapped on because of things like industrial agriculture and just general waste. And you look around, there are pockets of, in Africa, I know in Pakistan, in Australia, where you go through droughts, people are running out of water. Why aren't there more people trying to solve this problem? I think it was Bear Grylls, the thing that sticks in my head the most from watching those TV shows back in the day was you can survive 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. So between food and water is always the thing that is a bigger concern. Why don't you think people are paying more attention to it?
Yeah, I think this is a very large topic about why, and there's definitely many reasons. But I'll name a few, right? Like, for example, first, water is not evenly distributed. I'm sure depending on where you live, your awareness of how large a water problem is going to be very different for, you living in Singapore, me living in San Francisco, versus someone who's right in the middle of it day in, day out. So the awareness around water is very uneven. And as a result, when we talk about innovation, when we talk about investment, when we talk about even policy, I think there is a quite a large kind of uh, separation and distance between where the challenge happens and where a lot of the decision makers sit. And then number two, I would say on top of that is that water is taken for granted. Water is something you must have to live. And so it's sort of the job of the government, or it's the job of your municipality and utilities to provide you that water. So nobody ever thinks about how much water costs and how much water we have. It's just something that you should have for many of us living, in a very privileged position. So I think there's many, we can talk about this for hours, but at the very minimum, these are some of the reasons. And as a result, what we see is that the effects of disruption to access to water is very rapidly catching up to us. And then now we're noticing.
I was consulting with a client yesterday, and his product helps people be aware of how long they've been in the shower. He said
Mm,
that when it comes to individual family homes, the shower and hot water in particular is not only like the biggest consumer of water, but it's one of the biggest consumers of energy. And they said that,
absolutely.
people take on average, like, I think, 10, I think he was saying 11 to 15-minute showers. Whereas if, you can get, and for years, what I've been doing is I put music when I go in the shower, and my showers last the length of one song. So that's how I kind of equate. So I'm going to do like a 3-minute, 3-minute shower. But he was saying in New Zealand, interestingly, there were only 3 cities which even charge for water. So, however much water you're using, it's kind of the government's responsibility to pay for it. They're not even being billed, so they're not even seeing the value of it, which I thought was crazy, because in Singapore, I believe this is one of the more expensive cities in the world for water, because most of it comes from Malaysia. And, Singapore has, I think, 4 desal plants. Like, water is a big issue here. And you're very aware of that. So it was quite interesting to hear that there are some places in the world that don't even charge for water.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And let us not even talk about how bad the infrastructure in some places. For example, like we are talking in North America right now about the water crisis that's happening in Mexico City. Well, a big part of the problem in North America is, depending on where you're at, 20%, 30%, 40% of the water is just lost through leakage in the pipes. Contrast that to Singapore, where two-thirds of the land of Singapore can catch water and store water. Right? It's like it's crazy. You kind of put some of these in next to each other.
I mean, to be fair to America, I imagine that many of those pipes are older than the country of Singapore. So, there's
That's very
probably a
true.
lot of reasons for that leakage. Tell me, Brian, how bad is the world's current water situation? What should people know?
Yeah. I think we can look at it in high statistical ways. 2 billion people around the world don't have sufficient access to sanitation and clean water. And, if we look at a more micro scale versus the global scale, a big part of the population that are at risk or, severely affected by lack of access to clean water is the global south. But at the same time, even major, major countries like US, European Union countries, we're having water problems too. Um, and so, it's, I think the numbers, if we focus on just the statistics, it actually makes the numbers seem unreal. Like a quarter of the world don't have water. Like it's just some big number and it's not very close to us. But I think what's more poignant for people might be to think about some of their friends and family that live in a place that you don't expect to have water problems. Friends we have in the EU, in America, in Hong Kong, and China, or wherever it might be, Australia. Um, and that might hit closer to home, that you just look at the number of increasing natural disasters or water related natural disaster event. That will give you a better picture of like, wow, just look at the past 10 years and how that's changed.
Yeah, and I think there is almost a misconception that people that are living in sort of more modern and developed cities won't have to face this problem. But the reality is, I've been saying this for years, and one of the reasons I was so interested to talk to you is because I didn't know how to get involved, but I really believe that wars are going to be fought over this. We've had for the last 20 years a lot of wars being fought over oil supply lines. Well, water is much more crucial to human existence than oil is, and when countries start running out, they're going to start looking for where can they get access to this, and that's going to cause huge, migration issues. It's going to cause huge political issues all over this, you know, all over this substance that nobody's thinking about, which it is concerning.
I totally agree, Zal. I think, I actually, not to the extent of what you're mentioning, but something that kind of became top of mind as you talk about this is like displacement, people having to move. Um, and I think that's something really interesting I've experienced just in the past couple of months. I was in Japan during New Year's a couple of months ago, and an earthquake hit like right on January 1st or something like that. And now it's been 5 months, and that region of Japan, Noto Peninsula, the power has been restored for a while, but they still don't have access to running water. Tens of thousands of homes don't have access to clean water. And what's happening is a lot of people there are basically moving away, and many of them just might never come back. And they're talking about how the entire peninsula now is facing this like population culture drain, because after this, and when you don't have water for such a long time, and you've maybe had some loss in your property or whatever, you're just not coming back anymore. Entire populations are shifting because of the lack of access to water, whether because of a natural event or just trend line over time. Like, oh, we no longer have enough. We got to move.
Tell me about what's the market for a product like yours? Where do you see that fitting in? This sort of like decentralized water creation.
Mm-hmm. First, I think it's a completely new market. But at the same time, we're also addressing a very fundamental need. So the way we see ourselves fit in is that we're a product that's bringing control, we're bringing security, and we're bringing you another option for getting clean water, essentially almost anywhere, anytime. Of course, we have to account for certain conditions, but for the most part, we're able to give you water, wherever you are, and just where there's water in the air for us to extract that out and create it for you. And so conceptually, I think my thesis is that this is definitely necessary for the world. We can't have the only option being this large scale desal plants or water treatment facilities, or having to dig 100 meters underground for water. We need more affordable, faster, and flexible options for water, and that's how I see Aquaria fitting in.
And tell me about the technology behind Aquaria. Sort of like, how did you develop it? What is it?
Yeah. So our core technology is around heat exchange. So we've developed heat recovery and exchange systems. So we've developed special materials, and then we've also designed the airflow, the inner mechanics of the machine so that we're maximizing active and passive heat exchange, so that the result is we're able to make high volumes of water using very little energy. I think the comparison I like to make here is the methodology for us building is kind of analogous to building a high performance car, where you can reduce the weight of the car to make the car go faster. You can build a more powerful engine to make the car go faster. And you can also kind of design the car so it's aerodynamic, so it's bullet shaped and not block shaped, and that will make the car go faster. So that's what we're doing with our systems, where the analogy for speed here is heat exchange. And the more we can do of that more effectively, more powerfully, more efficiently, then we're creating large volumes of clean water just from the air.
So, okay, I live in Singapore. The weather here is either hot or wet. And when it rains, wow, it can come down, right? It's an epic amount,
I've
and an
experienced it.
epic volume of water. So how much are we talking about? How much water is in the air?
A lot. And actually, Zal, for my, some of my Singaporean friends that might listen to your show, if they hear about this, they'll immediately kind of yell at me, because every time I come to Singapore, even it's been sunny for days, immediately it starts raining the moment I land at the airport. It's like I somehow gather the clouds. um, to
Which is,
to
by the way,
answer.
great for good for your business, I would imagine, right? Like if you can bring the water wherever you go, that's a power.
So one of my friends have said, since I've started this company, I've become a walking billboard, because wherever I go, that it starts raining. um, actually, there's a lot of water in the air. I think if we think back to hydrologic cycle, we learned in earth science, every 7 to 8 days, the entire water in the atmosphere gets replenished through just evaporation and the natural hydrologic cycle. And so there's actually 200 times more water in the air than what humans consume annually. If we talk about figures, it's about 13,000 cubic kilometer of water in the air, and then that gets replenished over and over again every single week. That's a lot.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot of water. Okay, if I extrapolate this, and let's say everybody in the world starts using one of these tools or one of these machines to generate the water that they need, is that going to impact anything in nature? Is that going to impact the water cycle in any way?
It doesn't. That's exactly my point. Now, I think the 200x number obviously is a very large number. Actually, I think about it, if there's 200 times more water in the air than what humans consume, we actually could feed everyone on Earth with water from the air. We can actually have all tap water on the spot where you're at, provide water for everyone on Earth, because that number is so high. Unless we said, okay, we have 8 billion people on Earth, unless somehow we had 160 billion people, then that would have an effect on the water system and we would draw it out. But since it's replenished, I think we can totally feed 8 billion people with water from the sky.
I mean, 160 billion people on this planet would cause, far more than those water issues. So tell me about installing this in your house. I'm guessing it's made more for like standalone houses versus apartment buildings. But so let's say I have a house. How does it work?
Yeah, we've built various versions of our product, and I like to make an analogy that we're building something like a Tesla Power Pack, but for water. So it comes in smaller sizes. We can go inside of your home. So, so you can, I don't know if that's your background or a green screen, but you could put in your living room, open the window in Singapore, and it can draw water right in. For the indoor unit, you actually just plug it into the wall, and that's the only thing you have to do. And it actually operates and looks like a very well-designed Apple aesthetics water cooler. But if you have a larger building, or you have a house, standalone house, or even a larger structure, then we would put the machine outside on your roof, powered by solar, and then that water would go then into the plumbing system of your building. And that way, when you're using the water, you actually can't tell a difference whether it's water from the sky or water from the ground. Um, of course, everything in between we can do. We can do community taps, but those are the main sizes and how we would install that on your property.
And I'm curious, and I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but I've wondered often, sort of, because you hear all these stories about, certain chemicals being in the water. How contaminated or bad is the water that we are drinking at the moment out of our taps, for those of us lucky enough to live in countries where I can drink the water out of our taps?
It really varies. It really varies. I mean, like right now in America, we're having this huge PFAS crisis. I mean, not just America, like everywhere. We have this PFAS crisis. We have microplastics being found everywhere. But I would say, generally speaking, it just varies. And you don't have a standard way to measure how bad it is unless you actually go test your water yourself, which actually I think there's some great consumer innovation companies that have come out where they provide you a quick, affordable home test and you can test the quality of your water. So I definitely encourage everyone to go do that. It's only maybe like
Oh, really?
20,
I might.
30, $20, $30.
Oh, I might get one of those because I know that I live in, like, by Singapore standards, quite an old building. It must be like 30, 40 years old. And I'm always curious because I only drink from the tap and I'm like, well, what's coming out of here? But I do remember a long time ago when I was living in Australia, and Singapore has this thing called New Water where they basically recycle the water because, as I said, it is a water stressed country. They're thinking of everything that they can do. And an Australian journalist was questioning the minister at the time, and the Singaporean minister, they're very sharp, the politicians here, unlike in other parts of the world. They asked the Australian guy, where are you from? And I think he said Sydney. And he said, okay, Sydney, that city was founded in around this, he knew the vague date. And he said, that means your water pipes were probably put in at this point. So he said, well, we pass our water through ultraviolet light, which kills basically all the bacteria that's in there after a series of processes. He said the contaminants, the mold, the mildew that's probably built up on your pipes, because your pipes are not PVC, they're concrete, they're this. He really broke down and he was very aware of how other countries were treating their water. And he said the amount of, I guess, infection, or that's probably the wrong word, contamination that was in the water in these older cities was probably 10x of what you got in Singapore, even though you might be drinking recycled water. So that was the first time where I was like, oh, that's such an interesting way of looking at it. And I definitely looked at my pipes in Melbourne differently after that.
It's very objective. It's very objective. And I think that's the correct view, because our filtration technology have advanced to a point where, as long as you know what is actually in the water, we have certain methods, not everything, but we have certain technologies and methodologies to actually treat that, including now there are great companies building PFAS destroying technologies. So, but the problem is with older pipes, you actually don't know what's in the pipes, or the mildew buildup and varies across delivery infrastructure. So I would bet that the new water and all the water in Singapore, including your building, is likely way better than 90+% of perhaps what water is available to our audience over here. But yeah, I think you can go online and buy one of those, home kits for fairly affordable price and give it a test.
I mean, it's so funny. I lived in India for a little while when I first started my businesses over there. And I think that India was really the first country that I lived in as an adult where you couldn't drink the water out of the tap. Because before that, I lived in Australia, I lived in Canada. You could drink the water out of the tap. And, I don't think I had quite an understanding of what a privilege that is, of what a privilege
Wow.
of, obviously I traveled to all over Southeast Asia and you can't really consume it. But when you're on holiday, it's a very different vibe. But when you are living in a country for a period of time, like I did in India, and you're so reliant on, these water deliveries that come to you, and you being so mindful about how everything is washed or what you're doing when you brush your teeth on a regular basis. It is such an absolute privilege to live in a country that you can drink the water out of the tap. And I think that a lot of people, it's one thing that many, many people take for granted because you don't even think about it. You just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And adding on to that, Zal, like you mentioned an Indian example, I can give you an example of that just an hour and a half from here in San Francisco, right? Actually, and earlier, about 6 months ago, so like end of last year, also made the news for the areas and communities near the Mississippi River, because in these areas the salt water is actually pushing inland and destroying the freshwater reserves. It's going up the river or uphill, essentially, upstream, however you like to call it. And so for all these communities, they start turning on the tap. It's now brackish water. It's now salt water. And so whether you're showering or you're trying to have brush your teeth or tap water, it's contaminated in a very different way. Same thing, but it's still contamination nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, Brian, I'm really glad that you're working on this problem because it really does sound like a global one, and one that, you know, I think a lot of people, you kind of think of the lesser developed parts of the world going through this as a problem, but really it's going to be widespread. And I lived in Australia, which goes through like horrific droughts every year, and water is a huge issue there. And in India, cities are running out. Like, we keep digging wells, and you have to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper because we're running out of that kind of ground level water. And yeah, it's going to be something that is very crucial, and just one of these impacts of climate change that people probably don't think about. Everybody thinks about the heat, the carbon, and that's what a lot of the focus on in the world. But this is another thing where, if you think about, I imagine for farming and industry are probably the largest uses of water versus home consumption, right?
Yes, agriculture uses a huge amount of water. Absolutely.
I was reading that, part of the problem in Mexico is the huge love of avocados, and avocado requires a huge amount of water to produce, right? Like, and that's what, they're now fighting for these water rights to make sure that they go into these avocado farms, literally bypassing villages of people. So people don't have water, but the farms that are growing the avocados that they sell, they have water, which is, whether that's right or wrong, I can't argue, but it's a terrifying thing to be faced with.
I'm actually quite optimistic. We talked about a lot of problems now, but let's talk about the optimism in here. I'm actually quite optimistic about where we're heading, because actually I think it's it's we need to have more attention put on the subject, but we have a lot of technologies to be able to produce more water, save more water, monitor our use, and change our behaviors. That's available. It's just the problem is that there's so little attention and so little investment in this area that the proportion to the problem is so large. Um, I think I don't know if did you see the videos out, like Elon Musk opening up for the World Water Forum in Bali recently? Did that ever come up on your feed at all? So
Oh,
actually,
I
I
haven't seen
wish.
it. I'll check it out.
Yeah, you should check it out. I mean, I wish I was there. I always have. I didn't know that they were holding the World Water Forum in Bali. I always want to excuse to go to Bali, but we have lots of different technologies, including desalination improvements, solar desalination, atmospheric water generation as we work on it. But we need to implement them as energy gets cheaper and more abundant, as we get towards, realistically, towards 2 cents a kilowatt hour for solar, even 5 cents a kilowatt hour for solar and batteries. That is a lot of renewable energy we can use to power desalination plants, to power atmospheric water generators, to provide different water production methods, because energy and water are so intertwined. So, if we're heading towards an abundant energy future, in a way, we can also head towards an abundant water future. But right now, that proportion is so out of sync. But with more attention, with more investment, and hopefully with more education, well, I think we can turn this around. We can produce lots of more water, and put our technologies to use.
Brian, I think that's probably a really great way for us to end it on that positive note, to say that there is solutions and there is technology that can mitigate and solve this problem. So thank you so much for your time, and for, I think I learned a lot about water and the situation that we're in right now.
Thanks, Al. Thanks for having me. I was super excited to get on here. I saw your 100 podcast milestone, so I'm glad that we can do this together. Thanks for having me.